What's up, History 265? What's up, YouTube? Here with lecture 11, digging deeper into the life of Audre Lorde and her famous line, "We were never meant to survive." So let us dig in to today's talk. We're going to be talking about today, brings us roughly from 1978 to 1981 or so, right? And we're going to begin by taking a look at one of the really most significant pieces that Lorde wrote at this time, the uses of the erotic. And to understand that not only as an individually important piece, but as a bigger part of her philosophy, the centrality of the erotic to political power, to the ways that we organize our lives, both our kinship lives as well as the political structures and institutions in which we operate. This is also an era where Lorde begins to get sick. It begins with a breast cancer scare, which then is going to proceed into an extended decade-long, longer than a decade, battle with cancer. And that's going to be a significant topic in these next couple lectures, as well as the documentary, right? Thinking about terminal illness, and that can be a topic that, especially given the way that we've had this year of so much death by illness and so few opportunities to properly mourn it, can be hard, right? But it can also be instructive. And Lorde's approach to thinking about wellness and health and disease, and especially as it relates to how those kind of come together with intersecting oppressions, well, that's going to be really instructive for us. So we're going to deal with this topic, but hopefully in a way that is productive and building. Then we're going to talk about some, well, sometimes productive, but sometimes unproductive tensions that are happening. Now, we know that Lorde is interested in the power of difference, right? And the way that our differences can be a source of strength, but that they need to be acknowledged. They need to be out there, right? And we can't ignore our differences, right? We can't pretend that we're all unified, we're all the same, in order to try to get some kind of peace between us. Instead, we need to honestly acknowledge our differences and work them out so that we can work stronger together. And that's what's happening in this last section on community building, where she's building connections with queer people of color, with third world women or women of color, with Black queer men, with all kinds of people, right? And what we're seeing is that as Lorde rises up, she's not content to just kind of be an individual superstar, right? But she's really trying to build these networks, these institutions, these durable ways of working with our differences, right? Not going around them or seeing them as something that we need to get through, but really seeing them as a source of strength for any kind of creation of power, right? Whether we're talking about a conventional political movement or whether we're talking about the sort of power that sustains us in everyday life. We'll be continuing with Warrior Poet. You may notice as you're going through that I'm getting a little bit ahead of you. Okay, and that's if you're following along strictly with the readings here in the book. And so the last lecture kind of pushes pretty close up to about 190. And this lecture probably jumps about maybe around 250, 260. But you're going to catch up in terms of if you stick with the reading, because I won't give a lecture when you watch the Berlin Years documentary. And so that will allow you to get on the same timeline as me. But today we're talking about 1978 to 1981 or so, and these four themes. So let us dive in to the uses of the erotic. So in 1978, Lorde wrote three really important essays that demonstrated that she was much more than a poet, right? And that she was going to make an impact that really stretched beyond the conventional literary artistic representation had already become somewhat famous for, into this feminist theoretical work that's really important, right? And is really in many ways endures even more brightly and boldly than her poetry. These three 1978 essays, Scratching the Surface, Uses of the Erotic, and Man-Child, all deal with the intersecting oppressions that construct our lives, but are often, especially in Lorde's moment, poorly understood, right? So Scratching the Surface deals with difficulties between women, right? Lorde is really interested in sisterhood. And as Robin Morgan and some other prominent feminists said many times during the late 60s and 70s, sisterhood is powerful, right? And Lorde would agree, but she'd say it's also complicated, right? That the relationships between women are not simply unified. It's not as all women are the same, all women are together. And in fact, issues of race and class, of sexuality, of religion and nationality are all coming together to create divisions between women, especially when those divisions aren't acknowledged by the people who are most privileged by those systems. Man-Child deals with the question of raising boys in a feminist way and in a way that comports with her Black lesbian politics and some of the difficulties of raising Jonathan in a society that has a very strict idea about gender and how it relates to kinship and parenting, right? And ideas about fathers and mothers, right? Now, we know that for a lot of lesbians at the time, there was a lot of pressure on them that made it hard to keep your children, right? That being a lesbian made many people, in the eyes of this male dominated cisgender heterosexual governance and judges, well, it made them unfit mothers, right? And so she's trying to figure out, right, how do I dig into these difficulties in a way that doesn't play into this pathologization of Black motherhood, of lesbian motherhood? Uses of the erotic is really important, and we'll talk about it and we'll take a deeper look at it just in 1 minute. Now, as she's doing this very kind of consciously nonfiction political kind of writing, Lorde is also beginning to work on a series of stories that are linked. And she's initially calling it, hey, I've been waiting on this corner for a long time. It's about her youth, right? And about her childhood and adolescence, but it's also about telling the story she wants to tell it, right? We can remember Audre Lorde, right? One of her first acts was to lop that Y off of her name that her parents gave her, right? To get that symmetry, that Audre Lorde, that same kind of 5 letters ending with E. And she did this, right? She renamed herself at an early age, and she's going to continue renaming herself through this work. But people aren't quite ready for what she's doing. It's unclear. It's not poetry, and it's not totally fictional, but it's also not a conventional memoir. And this kind of genre crossing, boundary crossing work is not going to immediately gain purchase with a lot of publishers who say, well, I think you're more of a poet, or I think this would fit better here, or you need to work with this. So she's going to be working on this piece that's going to come around, and we'll talk more about in our next lecture, as her biomythography, as Zami, a new spelling of my name. And that term, right, there's going to be a key one that comes into Lorde's life in 1979 when she went to a Black feminist retreat and met Gloria Joseph. Gloria Joseph is a Black Caribbean feminist who identifies with this term Zami, this term that refers to women who lived, worked, and loved together in these Caribbean contexts where there was often a highly imbalanced sex ratio. Men often were working, going abroad, working outside. They were away from the homes that tended to be run by groups of adult women who, in addition, again, to working together, also formed really intimate and erotic relationships with each other. The term Zami, right, and its specifically Afro-Caribbean context, right, is not totally reducible or relatable, equatable to the term lesbian, but there's a lot of overlap, right? But Gloria Joseph starts to talk to Lorde about these issues and to kind of bring out this specifically Afro-Caribbean way of thinking through relationships between women. Let's turn, before we talk more about Gloria Joseph and about some of these shifts going on in Lorde's life, because Gloria Joseph is going to be Audre Lorde's primary partner for the last decade of her life, so we haven't heard the last from her. But let's just turn our gaze a bit to this 1978 essay, Uses of the Erotic. Okay, and so Uses of the Erotic, as I said, is a really important piece, right? And we want to understand the multiple layers going on in it, right? That in many ways it is a critique of people who talked about a division between the serious politics, materialist politics, right, and kind of conventional politics, and the somewhat frivolous world of erotic pleasure, of desire, of these things that are seen to be separate, right? And the Lord says, no, right? These are actually really tied up in each other. And the denial of the erotic, right? The denial of what is felt and cannot be fully represented in language, right? Because her definition of erotic, we don't want to narrow it down to just the sexual or the genital, right? The erotic is what is felt but cannot be fully expressed in words. And she says that that's an incredible source of power for more conventional political work. And that one of the ways that political work has been kind of narrowed and confined in this patriarchal definition is by denying the erotic, denying the felt, right? And we've talked about how this fundamental kind of idea of separate spheres, this gender binary idea, says that like men are rational and women are bound to the body, right? And what Lord is saying is that, well, first off, right, everybody, right, lies within each of us. The erotic is something that isn't really going to be selective about gender, right? But instead, we have a gender system that is imposed upon the erotic and attempts to kind of split it out into this binary, right? And in many ways, Lord talks about how this approach, right, reduces the erotic from this kind of spiritual, this kind of transcendent kind of place to one that she says is plastic, is pornographic, she says, right? And she's using that term not necessarily in the same descriptivist way that we might think of, but to say that there's a reduction and a commodification of what is deeply felt into what can be packaged and sold. And so we can think more about this essay. I've thought a lot about this essay and talked a lot about this essay over the years. So I'll wrap it up there on uses of the erotic. But I'd say you want to take a look at it. You want to think about it, right? And you need to read beyond the kind of surface and to think about the erotic in ways that are maybe more complex than that term first comes across to us. Let's shift gears a little and talk about the encroachment of illness on Lord's life. So on Labor Day 1978, while doing a self-exam, Audre Lorde discovered a lump that led to a breast cancer diagnosis and then a radical mastectomy, a full removal of one of her breasts. It was customary, conventional at the time to really try to hide that in a number of ways, right? And so a lot of people, after such a surgery, they might eventually seek some kind of plastic surgery to replace the lost breast. A lot of people, was common to wear a falsie, right, and wear a breast to try to even one's appearance. But Lord embraced that asymmetry, right? And we can see it if we look at a number of pictures from that time, right? That cover image picture of her standing there in that shirt, right? We can see, if we look, right, that asymmetry that she really played up in a way that was unconventional and was seen in some ways as kind of out of line, like it was unruly to be so in her body and to display this loss as something that was actually a source of strength, right? Because she drew upon the inspirations that she found in the world about the way that a breast is not necessarily equivalent to or womanhood, right? That femininity is not reducible to one secondary sex characteristic, even if that one is hyper emphasized by the patriarchal gaze, right? So she drew upon Sebulisa, right? This West African goddess whose breast was eaten up by the kind of the torment of the suffering of people she was seeing. And Amazonians, right, in a mythical group of women kind of based off of some real life women warriors who were said to willingly and quite directly remove one of their breasts so that they could better draw a bow and arrow and be better warriors. And she said, this surgery, right, this mastectomy is not a maiming, right? It's not something that leaves me less. It's a warrior mark. It's a sign of my preparedness for battle and for the struggles that I have survived and endured. A lot of her thoughts from this time, from mostly from 1979, get collected into the Cancer Journals. Okay? And this is one of Lord's most important work. And one of the ways we know it's important, and we can see it's been significant, is that it's had a lot of different editions, right? It began as a very simple, almost a pamphlet, then turned into a more serious book where we can see, right, Lord on the cover there in her kind of Afrocentric garb at that time in the Chele. We can see her one earring as well, right? That asymmetry that she was playing up. We can see that the Cancer Journals have been translated into many languages and that new editions continue to emerge. This is an important book on many levels. It's important to me personally. My mother is a cancer survivor. She had lung and brain cancer, and starting in 2010, has been in remission for a number of years. And Audre Lorde's work, specifically the Cancer Journals, was a great comfort to her as she went through treatment. So this is one of the ways that Lorde's impact, right, can't be confined to any one label, can't be confined to poet, can't be confined to Black lesbian work, right, is one that's really crossing all of these boundaries and existing in these multiple ways at once, right? Because this Cancer Journals is no less poetic or no less a Black lesbian work for being so relevant for anybody, and especially for people who are going through cancer at that time, and especially if you have breast cancer, or especially if you're dealing with some of the same comorbidities or intersecting oppressions that Lorde was dealing with, right? So this is a big, going to really elevate Lorde's profile again, not only in the United States, but on a global stage, as people all over the world are trying to deal with a general increase in the rate of cancers as people are living longer, as there are more carcinogens in the environment all over the world, right? And not a lot of people at that time in 1980 were talking this explicitly about cancer. Cancer was often something that you're expected to suffer in silence, out of sight. And Lorde was quite visible about it, right? She kind of drew upon Zora Neale Hurston's dictum that if they hurt you and you don't say anything about it, that later on they're going to say you liked it, right? And so she's saying, no, right? I'm not going to hide what I'm going through. I'm going to share it with the world because it all wasn't necessary, right? And if you read the Cancer Journals, these experiences of dehumanization, racism, sexism, erotophobia, and homophobia are all going to play key roles in how she navigates this illness. Talking now about some of the tensions within women's movements that are really accelerating in 1979 into the early 80s, as Lorde is refusing to sort of be the woman that other people want her to be, right? And really embracing herself in her fullness and at a really kind of ascendant moment in her career, right? So we've talked about how she was a key founding member in the editorial board of Chrysalis, this feminist magazine for which she did the poetry editing. She's going to leave and break up fully with Chrysalis by the end of 1979 over conflicts about the role of poetry in feminist thought, right? Lorde says it's crucial, it's central, right? Whereas some of the people working at Chrysalis, these women see it as frivolous, as extra, as artistry that might be pretty and added on to the serious political work, but not at the heart of it. And Lorde says no, right? If you don't understand that a lot of theorizing, especially from women of color, emerges not through conventional kind of theoretical academic publications, but through art, through poetry, through these forms that are much more available to people outside of the academy, well, then you've got a different idea of feminism. We can also see really kind of a sharp conflict, and one that informs us to this day, open up in the summer of 1979 when Lorde gives this open letter, this public critique of Mary Daly, the radical feminist author of the book Gynecology. Gynecology was really popular at that time. Radical feminism was making a big impact and was a big part of the kind of the space occupied by feminist thought and theory, right? And Lorde pushed back, right? She said, no, this book, in many ways, and you can read the letter to get the full kind of details of the critique, but she said that this book both erases Black women and women of color and then selectively mobilizes them and uses them to make these arguments that ultimately kind of just refer back to and keep the spotlight, the central focus on white women, right? That Mary Daly would only talk about women of color to the degree that they confirmed her hypothesis that everywhere all societies were organized around the patriarchal oppression of women. A little later that year, and we'll take a deeper look at this piece, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. And this is Lorde's most read work, it's her most quoted work, and it's a really complicated one. Like so many parts of her, there is an attempt to reduce, to simplify, right? To take this piece of several pages and reduce it just to a soundbite, just to its title, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper look at that and try to understand that, right, in its context, and also understand why it, more than anything else, really has stuck with people. Another really key kind of entry point into these tensions is the essay Uses of Anger, right? Lorde is becoming much more self-assured in the late 70s, speaking her mind, speaking her truth. And a lot of people are reacting by saying, oh, Audrey, why so angry, right? And this stereotype of the angry Black woman is going to really dog her ability to express herself, right? Because when she is clear, when she is direct, when she says what she means, what she needs, the response is, you're so angry, right? And so we want to think about that tone policing, right? And that tone policing that still goes on, especially when it comes to Black women, and in general with attempts to call oppression into public view, right? That often people will say, well, I agree with your point, but your tone, right? I don't like your tone, right? But we're talking about oppression here. We're talking about people's lives, right? Remember, we cannot live without our lives is that slogan of the third world feminist movement, right? We're not talking about your sort of sensibilities in terms of your feelings about, oh, are people too angry? We're talking about lives here, right? And so Lorde in the Uses of Anger really clarifies that and really pushes back against that stereotype that unfortunately we're still dealing with, right? That Black women have to be very careful about how they express themselves in this patriarchal white supremacist society, lest they be labeled too angry. And a lot to be angry about, right? And the Master's Tools essay really gets at that, right? Gets at both the struggles that are going on and then the possibilities for coming together, right? And that sometimes some forms of struggle might be complicit with the oppressions that they seek to overturn, right? And so Lorde says we need community, right? We need to come together, but we need to come together in a way that doesn't require anyone to shed their difference, right? And she says that I need to come to this, right, with my full self, with all of my complexity, all my difficulties, all my multiple identities, all of my successes and privileges and skills, right? That what comes together needs to, or is strongest when we learn how to take our differences and make them strengths, right? And what she's saying here and is trying to get at, and again, you want to read it on your own, you want to take it on your own, but what she's trying to get at is that success is not just a matter of imitating power, of acting like power, of reproducing this system of inequality, just kind of shuffling around who's at the top. She said, no, right? We don't want to do that, right? It's not simply a matter of inverting the existing order, but it's really about getting away from a hierarchical rendering, and she's using this metaphor to think about plantation slavery in the United States, right? And this idea of the master's house, right, is directly grounded in that history of chattel slavery and the different approaches that people might take in terms of resisting that, overturning that system, right? And so she's saying we need to move away from an attempt to seize power and kind of seize control of the unequal system of power, but rather it's about changing these systems. It's about redistributing power so it is not so unequally hoarded and held at the top. Not trying to rise up into those positions, but to really bring those positions and equalize them with the rest of society. Again, key piece, dig into it, learn more about it, read it in full if you would like. You don't have to, but it can be very illuminating. We're going to talk now, jump ahead a few slides here. All right, here we go. Community building, right? So we're going to talk about two important threads of Lord's work here as we kind of move towards the end of today's talk here. These two important threads are going to be the national gay and lesbian movement, as well as a growing network, a transnational network of women of color, really solidified or kind of based around Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. So the 1979 March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights was a hugely significant event. It's the first national mobilization of gay and lesbian political power. And it's preceded in the days before in Washington, D.C. by a national Third World Gay and Lesbian Conference. This is a really important event in a number of ways, right? Because it's bringing together a lot of different groups from around the country who have a lot of affinity in the work they're doing, but aren't necessarily connected, right? We're talking pre-internet here, right? So it was hard to build those kind of networks as easily as we do today, right? And this site, the 1979 March on Washington, is a big display of not only the power of gay and lesbian politics at the end of 1970s, but also the diversity within that, right? And the ways in which we can see all over the march that gay and lesbian politics are not just represented by one form, by one approach, by one place, right? There are people from all over the country. There are people who are really radical. There are people who are really assimilationists. There are people who are in between. There are pretty conservative groups that are patriotic and are based on the veterans movement or based on parenting. They're in religious groups. And then there are also really, really radical leftist groups, the National Black Feminist Organization, a lot of different political tendencies all coming together. And as a highlight, as the kind of keynote on the eve of the march, is famous poet Audre Lorde, right? So this is a big moment in a number of ways, right? It's a big moment because we can see that she is basically being held up as, one of, if not the most significant gay and lesbian thinker, political activist of the moment, right? And we can also see that it's really kind of, it's important, right? Not just for Lorde, right? But is this important moment in terms of the movement, right? In terms of pushing back against that backlash and demonstrating that we're not going to go into hiding, right? And that things aren't going to just slide back into the place that the Anita Bryants of the world want to bring it into. At this conference, one conversation that was happening, especially at the National Third World Gay and Lesbian Conference, was the insufficiency of terms for people who were negatively affected by white supremacy. Right? The National Black Feminist Organization, when approached by a number of women who were mostly Asian American, decided to bring together an alliance around this term, Third World, right? Which was popular at the time for thinking about countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America that were outside of the first world, the wealthy industrial capitalist nations, and the second world, the slightly less wealthy but very industrialized socialist nations. This term Third World, though, didn't fully encapsulate everything people were going for, and increasingly becomes replaced by the term women of color, people of color, men of color, right? Which we hear today and is shifting, right? Like we hear more and more Black, Indigenous people of color and people kind of specifying Black and Indigenous at the beginning. But at this moment, right, the idea was to have a term, a short, simple one that brought people together around a common investment against white supremacist patriarchy. right? The idea of women of color was not that there's some fundamental biological unity between non-white people, but it was that Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American, and all kinds of women negatively impacted by white supremacy could come together and could choose to form an alliance, right? That it's a term of chosen alliance rather than one that is kind of a universal to apply to a large group of people on the base of some commonality, right? Rather, it's strength and unity within difference. Let's take a look at some images to bring it to life, and to think about both the 1979 march as well as Kitchen Table. So these are some images from the 1979 march. We can see the organization PFLAG, which you might be familiar with, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, had its first kind of coming out here, right? And this is a significant moment, right? Because this is kind of a conscious crafting of an organization that is a term that wasn't floating around much at the time, but we hear a lot these days, allies, right? And this idea that you would have an organization and be politically committed to the advancement of gay and lesbian justice or civil rights from the position of being in relation and being in intimate or kinship relation with gay and lesbian people. You see below me the message, "We are everywhere," and that was a big part of 1979. They asked people to carry signs from their hometowns, especially if you were like from, I don't know, someplace in, say, North Dakota or Oklahoma or out there where there wasn't necessarily an expectation of there being a strong gay and lesbian presence. People were encouraged to really show off their state pride in order to demonstrate this message, "We are everywhere," right? And we can see behind that banner with the Martin Niemöller quote this is a Protestant responding to the Holocaust in Germany in the 1930s. And he said, "First, the Nazis came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out. I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for the trade unionists, the Catholics, the communists, all these other groups. I didn't speak out because I wasn't part of those groups. But then when they came for me, there was no one left to speak out, right? Because I let this happen, right?" And so this connection, right, and drawing these comparisons to resisting fascism and resisting Nazism with sexual and gender liberation and justice is going to be an important theme, right? And it dramatizes things, right? But we also know that there is that very literal connection, right? That the Nazis rounded up and sent to concentration camps thousands and thousands of especially gay men and also lesbians. We can also see over there on the side a couple Leathermen. Leather style was really big in the 1970s, and this is going to be part of that attempt to present an image of gay men that is macho, that is hard, that is masculine, that can be really sexy and exciting, right? But is also one that can sometimes be exclusionary, right? And that some people push back and say that, actually, like some of this Leatherman culture kind of idealizes a Nazi fascist aesthetic, and it's really questionable, okay? And so we want to understand that this is an important cultural feature, right? A subcultural feature that's becoming very visible at this moment and has become less visible over time, but needs to be understood in its context, in its complexity. Couple more images. We can see Anita Bryant was a major target of a number of protesters in 1979. And we want to acknowledge that eventually some of the ways in which Anita Bryant was talked about and discussed and kind of pilloried could be really misogynistic, right? That there was this way in which there was sometimes an embrace of really kind of hateful and dangerous endorsements of violence going beyond what you see above me here, even more extreme than that, that we could see is complicit with misogyny, right? So we want to recognize that these are ongoing kind of tensions here, right? That 1979 is a moment where, Audre Lorde connects with Joseph Beam and Essex Hemphill, and we can kind of see Black gay men and Black lesbians coming and working together. But we can also see that this was a moment that some people walked away feeling insulted or marginalized. We can see in the program down at the bottom, I know it's a little bit small there, but you can see that the main event, the dinner speaker, is going to be Audre Lorde, the keynote speaker, and she is at the time labeled as noted writer and author of The Black Unicorn. So she's still most famous for being this Black lesbian poet as opposed to this theorist political activist. And we can also see that there were a lot of Vietnam vets in the 1979 march, a lot of whom were putting out that message that they served their country in Vietnam, and now they were being treated as second-class citizens upon their return. One last piece on the 1979 march that we might look at. So this I pulled off of the Archives of Gender and Sexuality. And there are a lot of great sources about the 79 march, the 87 march, the 93 march, and a little bit on the 2000 Millennium March too, on the Archives of Gender and Sexuality. So that archive, you can get it through the resource guide, you can get it through Western libraries, tons of great sources about the LGBTQ plus past. And what we want to see here is that the 1979 march went in consciously thinking about representational issues, right? Issues that are very much on our minds today, regardless of the movements that we're participating in, right? To think about the ways in which women and people of color had historically been marginalized in LGBTQ plus movements, and how there needed to be a commitment, right? A serious commitment to making sure that women and people of color were not merely kind of token included, but made up a significant portion in a sort of portion proportionate to their place in the population in not only the march itself, but in the organizing committee, in paid staff positions, right? So this level of commitment, right, which in some ways, that we want to be clear, right, doesn't resolve the issues of racism and misogyny, right? But this is a level of commitment that certainly we don't see institutions committed to today, right? Committing to gender parity, committing to minimum levels of representation of people of color in paid positions, speakers, entertainers, in public presentations, right? Western doesn't have standards like this for sure. Now, we want to understand this, right? Again, in its context, we want to think about both the history that led up to it, as well as the impacts afterwards. And we also would like to maybe put this in comparison to, do these kind of standards, are they maintained for, say, the next big national mobilization in 1987? Or do these concerns not kind of rise to the same level, right? We want to, again, depending on what you write about for your final exam essay, depending on what you're interested in, this might be worth diving into more. We can also find some great sources about Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, really, really important press, put out some really important work. And one of the things you can see here, hopefully, is that when I search on the archives for Kitchen Table Press, right, the documents that have it gives me that green highlight. Right, so it helps me, the search feature is going to help me locate what I want. Now, obviously, both of these flyers are very much about the press, and so it's not hard to find that, right? But if you're searching for a more specific term, right, it can be really helpful as you page through the various parts of the collection to have that highlight mode in place to help you locate your search terms. And of course, Kitchen Table Press, right, is a really, really important publishing house, one of the first, perhaps the first, to be fully run by women of color at every stage, right? So the writings are by women of color, the editors are women of color, the publishers are women of color. And this reflects, right, those conditions where Lorde had been putting out this work, but always having to kind of deal with white institutions, white power authorities, in her attempts to get her work out to the world. Zooming in on Kitchen Table for a moment and thinking about these alliances that Lorde is forming in this moment, we want to recognize, right, this important work across difference and the ways in which the term women of color was intentionally chosen to cultivate multiple possibilities within that position. Sherry Moraga is one of the co-founders of Kitchen Table, a really important feminist theorist. She's Chicana, she writes plays, and really deals with the complexities of Chicana Mexican American identity and the multiplicity of that, right? That interweaving of backgrounds and the complicated racialization of people who are, again, variously racialized in the United States as Latina, Latino, Latinx, or Latine, or Hispanic, Chicana, these different terms that are floating around, right? And so Moraga, still alive today, came to Western a few years ago, really important thinker, right? And a really important person in terms of not only her individual work, but that collective work with the press to put this work out. Leota Lone Dog, who is Lakota and Mohawk, was also in the Kitchen Table Collective. We've read about both with Lorde and way back with Beth Brant, the way that especially lesbians of color were facing a lot of pressure on their parenting in the 1970s. And Leota Lone Dog worked to advocate for lesbian mothers, especially lesbian mothers of color, indigenous mothers, to make sure that they could keep those kids, that those kids weren't taken away, much like they had been in these older systems of more direct racial subjugation. And finally, we can see Lorde with Jewel Gomez, again, a really important thinker, a contributor to the Homegirls anthology. And if you're into vampire stuff, right, you gotta read Jewel Gomez's The Guild of Stories. This like this lesbian vampire crosses all of these different eras. Really exciting story. Jewel Gomez, who is Black and Native, still alive, still doing cool work. And there's talk of adapting the Guild of Stories into like a Netflix movie. And so hopefully we'll also see that emerge someday. So that brings us pretty much to the end today. So let us review ever so briefly what we talked about. Lorde poetry is getting international acclaim, right? It's becoming, she's on Norton, people are reading it, people think she's a big deal, and she's kind of like, well, you know what? I got more arrows in the quiver, right? Poetry is just one line on the resume. And as her poetry is really getting some of its biggest, most attention and success, she's pivoting into both this nonfiction critique as well as her writing her biomythography, her genre-shattering kind of work that's really going to become her most celebrated stuff. And so we'll talk about in the next lecture her master works, Zami, Sister Outsider, and Chosen Poems. What we'll see, right, as we get into any of those is the development of her focus on the creative use of difference, right? The ways in which we are stronger when we come together across our difference and are able to use that as a source of power. Okay, that's an important part of her kind of individual, her intimate relationships. It's an important part of her political organizing. It's an important part of the way that she sees her movement through the world. She's excited by difference. She's not as excited by sameness, right? By always kind of trying to keep things in a homogeneity, right? And saying we can only work with people who are the same as us. No, she says we're stronger as we work across our differences and as we build our strengths, as long as we come honest about the meaning of those differences, as long as we can accurately explore them, right? Because we're not coming together with our differences if she has to deny her Blackness to make white people comfortable, or she has to deny her being a lesbian in order to make straights comfortable, right? In this moment, that some incredible stuff is happening, right? Really intellectually, artistically productive years. Lorde is also getting sick. She survives very, very well her first bout with cancer, but unfortunately, as we will see, right, it's going to be something that is recurring and something that is going to very much limit her ability to enjoy some aspects of her final years of life, but it is certainly not going to stop her in her tracks, and she remains significant and productive and important to the bitter end. What now? So here we have a little meme below here from the letter to Mary Daly, right? And some questions from Audre Lorde to think about, right? Do you ever read the work of Black women? Do you ever read my work, or did you merely finger through them for quotations which you thought might valuably support an already conceived idea concerning some old and distorted connection between us? This is not a rhetorical question. Okay, so um, this week, Wednesday, come see me at office hours. Thursday is Audre Lorde's birthday. Friday, Pod Convo 11 and your reply to number 10 are due. And then there's only 3 weeks left in the quarter. So we will be moving towards the end of our unit on Audre Lorde. We'll be moving then into our last unit, reflecting back on LGBTQ plus history, thinking queerly about history. And one other thing to put on your horizon is Chan-Hee Choi's talk on March 4th. She's developed a video game about being Asian American during COVID. It's going to be really cool. I'll talk more about it a little bit later. But for now, I hope you're all warm and cozy, and I hope that you stay warm and dry. Take care of yourselves and each other.